The tithe was a promise made in blood and fear 3 centuries ago, a scar carved into the heart of the valley. Every 10 years, the king under the mountain sent his emissaries, silent and cloaked in shadow, and they would stand in the square as a name was drawn from the reaping bowl. One child, to be fostered in the obsidian halls of the night court, never to be seen again. It was a tax paid for peace, for the guarantee that the shadows would not spill from their ancient fortress and swallow the village whole. A story told to frighten children into behaving, except it was horribly, unequivocally true. Ilara had lived her entire life in the shadow of that promise. She had been a child when the last tithe was paid, had watched little Thomas Hemlock's mother collapse into a silent, shuddering heap as his name echoed off the cobblestones. The memory was a cold stone in her gut, a constant, low-grade fear that had sharpened into a blade of pure terror the day her son, Leo, was born. He was all she had. His father, a shipwright with eyes the color of the sea, had been taken by that same sea 2 years ago, leaving a hole in their lives that Ilara had tried to fill with twice the love, twice the protection. Leo was a sunbeam of a child, all bright laughter and scraped knees, his hair a shock of pale gold against the perpetual gray of the valley. He was her heart, living and breathing and running through the fields outside their cottage. Today was the day of the reaping. For 6 days now, a suffocating quiet had fallen over the village. Doors were barred early, conversations were whispers, and the air itself seemed thin and brittle, ready to shatter. Ilara had held Leo close each night, his small, warm body a fragile shield against the encroaching dread. She told him stories of brave knights and clever foxes, but the words felt like ash in her mouth. This morning, she had dressed him in his finest tunic, a deep blue that made his eyes shine like summer sky. She brushed his hair until it gleamed, her hands trembling so badly she had to stop and press them against the rough wood of the table. "Why do we have to go, Mama?" he'd asked, his small voice cutting through the thick silence of their cottage. She knelt before him, forcing a smile that felt like cracking porcelain. "It is just a formality, my love. A silly tradition. We go, we stand for a moment, and then we will come home and I will make you honey cakes." It was a lie. A desperate, fragile lie. The square was a sea of grim faces. Families huddled together, a collective held breath. No one looked at anyone else, as if eye contact might somehow transfer the curse. At the center of the square, on the steps of the town hall, stood the reaping bowl, a simple wooden thing that held the power of life and death. Beside it stood the king's emissaries, 2 figures so tall and still they seemed carved from night itself. They wore no masks, but their faces were pale, impassive canvases, their eyes holding the flat, patient emptiness of eternity. The mayor, a man whose jolliness had been leached away until only a grey husk remained, stepped forward. His hands shook as he reached into the bowl. The rustle of the paper slips was the only sound in the world, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. Ilara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She squeezed Leo's hand, his small fingers clutching hers with trusting strength. Not him, she prayed, a silent, desperate scream to any god that might be listening. Please, anyone but him. The mayor unfolded the paper. His face went slack, his eyes finding Ilara's in the crowd with a look of wretched pity. And then he spoke the name, his voice a dead thing in the unnaturally still air. Leo. The world did not end. The sky did not fall. There was only a profound, ringing silence in Ilara's ears. The sound of her own world breaking apart. Leo looked up at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. Mama! The crowd shifted, a collective exhalation of relief that was its own kind of violence. They were safe. Their children were safe. Their pity was a distant, academic thing. Ilara felt their eyes on her, but they didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the small hand in hers and the name that hung in the air like a death sentence. One of the emissaries moved, a fluid uncoiling of shadow. He started to descend the steps. And in that moment, something inside Ilara, some primal, maternal instinct, broke through the ice of her shock. It was not courage. Courage was feeling fear and acting anyway. This was something else entirely. This was the simple, biological impossibility of letting her child be taken. It was not a choice. It was a law of her own nature. She scooped Leo into her arms, his wiry body clinging to her, and she turned her back on the emissary. She did not run. There was nowhere to run. Instead, she began to walk, her steps deliberate, each one a declaration of war. She walked away from the square, away from the gasping villagers, and toward the winding path that led up into the jagged, teeth-like mountains. Toward the king's fortress. If the king wanted her son, he would have to look her in the eye and take him. She would not make it easy. She would not stand aside. She would go to the heart of the shadow and she would stand. It was all she had left to do. The emissaries did not stop her. They simply fell into step behind her, their silent presence a cold weight on her back. They knew where she was going. All roads, for the damned, led to the mountain. The journey was a blur of cold wind and sharp stones. Ilara's arms ached, but she did not put Leo down. He was a warm, living weight against her chest, his soft breaths puffing against her neck. He had fallen into a fretful sleep, his face burrowed into her shoulder, blessedly unaware of the two silent shadows pacing them from behind. The path grew steeper, the air thinner. The sun was a pale, forgotten coin behind a thick shroud of cloud that seemed to perpetually cling to the peaks. The fortress appeared slowly, coalescing from the mist and rock, a structure of impossible scale and brutalist beauty. It was not a castle of fairy tales, with soaring turrets and graceful lines. It was a fang of obsidian thrust up from the mountain's heart, a place of sharp angles and deep shadows, its windows like vacant eyes staring down at the world it ruled. The great gates, wrought from a black metal that seemed to drink the light, swung open without a sound as she approached. The emissaries gestured for her to enter, their first communication since the square. Ilara's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm, but her face was a mask of stone. She would not show them her fear. She would not give them that. She stepped across the threshold, and the gate swung shut behind her, the sound a deep, final boom that echoed in her bones. The inside was a cavern of cold, silent grandeur. The air was still and ancient, scented with stone dust, beeswax, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old roses and spilled wine. A vast hall stretched before her, its ceiling lost in shadow, held aloft by columns that looked like the petrified ribs of some colossal beast. Torches burned in sconces along the walls, their flames unnaturally steady, casting long, dancing shadows but providing little warmth. Figures lined the hall, standing as still as statues. The night court. Vampires. They were beautiful, terrifyingly so, their faces sculpted with an artist's cruel precision, their eyes holding the predatory gleam of creatures who had outlived empires. They watched her, their gazes a physical weight, a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and a faint, unsettling hunger. They saw a peasant woman in a worn wool dress, clutching a child. A morsel that had wandered into the lion's den. Ilara ignored them. Her focus was singular, aimed at the far end of the hall where a dais rose from the flagstones. Upon it sat a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian, and on the throne sat the king. He was the still point in the turning world, the source of the hall's oppressive silence. He was older than the stones around him, and it showed not in wrinkles or infirmity, but in a profound, soul-deep weariness that clung to him like a shroud. His hair was the color of polished silver, long and straight, falling over the high collar of his black tunic. His face was a masterpiece of aristocratic planes and angles, beautiful but remote, like a statue of a fallen god. But his eyes were the color of embers, glowing with a low, internal fire, and they held the vast, lonely emptiness of a starless night sky. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable, his long-fingered hands resting motionless on the arms of his throne. Ilara's steps faltered for a fraction of a second. The sheer weight of his presence, his ancient and terrible power, pressed down on her, threatening to crush the breath from her lungs. This was madness. This was a mouse trying to reason with a hawk. But then Leo stirred in her arms, murmuring her name in his sleep, and the fire in her spine rekindled. She stopped at the foot of the dais, tilting her head back to meet the king's gaze. She did not kneel. She did not bow. She stood, a mother, a shield, her body a defiant line drawn between the monster and her child. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. A low murmur rippled through the assembled court, a sound of disbelief and outrage. The king's head tilted slightly, a slow, deliberate movement. His ember eyes narrowed, taking in her patched dress, the smudges of dirt on her cheek from the journey, the fierce, unwavering set of her jaw. He saw the terror she was trying so hard to conceal, and the monumental resolve that held it at bay. "You are the mother," he said. His voice was not the monstrous growl she had expected. It was a low, resonant baritone, smooth as polished jet, yet carrying the gravelly undertone of immense age, of words spoken over centuries. "I am," Elara said, her own voice surprisingly steady. She clutched Leo tighter, his warmth a small sun against the chilling cold of the hall. "You know the law. The tithe is the price of peace. A promise sealed in blood," he stated, not as a threat, but as a simple, immutable fact. "It is a promise made by men long dead to a king who does not die," she countered, the words tasting like rebellion on her tongue. "It has nothing to do with him," she nodded toward the sleeping child in her arms. "He is my son." A collective hiss rose from the court. The audacity, the insolence of this mortal. One of the courtiers, a woman with hair like spun shadow and lips the color of blood, took a step forward. "My king, allow me to teach this creature some respect." "Silence, Lilith," the king commanded without looking at her. The word was spoken softly, yet it cracked through the hall like a whip, and the woman froze, her beautiful face contorting in a brief flash of fear before she retreated into the ranks. The king's gaze returned to Elara. It was intense, searching. For the first time in centuries, Cosimir felt something other than the crushing ennui of his own existence. He had seen empires rise and fall, seen generations of humans live and die like moths fluttering against a windowpane. He had seen fear in 1,000 forms, cowering, begging, defiant, suicidal. But this was different. This was not the brittle bravery of a soldier facing death. This was the unyielding, elemental force of a mother protecting her young. It was pure, absolute, and utterly selfless. It was a light, so fierce and bright, in the unending twilight of his life. He had expected tears, pleas, a broken woman on her knees. He had not expected this quiet, unshakable dignity. This, fire. "He is one child," the king said, his voice softer now, a genuine curiosity coloring his tone. "You would defy me, defy my entire court, risk the peace of your village, for one child." Elara met his gaze without flinching. Her heart was a wild bird trapped in her ribs, but her voice was clear as a bell. "He is not one child," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the entire hall. "He is my child. And you cannot have him." And in that moment, watching the unwavering honesty in her tired, beautiful, human eyes, Cosimir, the Night King, the ancient and the terrible, felt a fissure crack through the frozen sea of his apathy. It was a feeling so alien he could not at first name it. It was awe. It was wonder. It was the sudden, shocking, and utterly overwhelming certainty that he had been waiting for this woman, for this moment, for longer than the mountains had been standing. He had seen her for less than a minute, and he knew, with the kind of profound instinct that only the truly ancient possess, that he was lost. He rose from his throne, a slow, graceful unfolding of power that made the very air in the hall grow heavy. The courtiers shrank back. He descended the steps of the dais, his movements silent, his gaze never leaving Elara's face. He stopped a mere arm's length from her, so close she could feel the cold radiating from his body, see the flecks of gold within his ember eyes. Leo shifted, his small face now visible, his breath a tiny, innocent cloud in the frigid air. Cosimir looked from the fierce defiance in the mother's eyes to the peaceful vulnerability of the child. He saw the bond between them, a thing of pure, mortal light. A thing he had never known. "You are brave," he whispered, the words intended for her alone. "Braver than any knight in shining armor I have ever had the displeasure of turning to dust." Elara's breath hitched. She could feel the predatory stillness of him, the immense power held in perfect, lethal check. "Give me the boy," he said, his voice a silken command. Her entire body tensed. No, the word was a breath, a prayer, a final act of defiance. He did not reach for Leo. Instead, a slow, strange smile touched his lips. It was not a cruel smile. It was something far more dangerous. It was genuine. "I will not harm him," he said. "But the law is the law. The tithe must be paid. A life for a life. A presence in my hall. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, an assessment that felt as if it were peeling back the layers of her soul. Very well. He is your son. But you are my guest. Ilara stared at him, confusion warring with her terror. What do you mean? I mean, Kosimir said, his voice dropping lower still, a conspiratorial murmur that sent a shiver down her spine, that the tithe requires a human presence. It does not specify which one. He looked at Leo, then back at her. He may remain with you. You both will stay here, under my protection. As my honored guests, he raised his voice, addressing the stunned and silent court. The tithe for this decade is paid. The woman Ilara and her son Leo will reside in the East Wing. They are not to be harmed. They are not to be frightened. They are to be treated with the respect due to my personal guests. Anyone who disobeys this command will answer to me directly. The finality in his tone was absolute. There would be no argument. Ilara stood frozen, Leo a heavy, precious weight in her arms. She had come to face a monster, to plead or to die. She had not expected this. A prison of silk and shadow instead of a quick, clean end. She had saved her son from the tithe only to trap them both in the heart of the mountain, under the watchful, burning eyes of the king who had, for a reason she could not possibly comprehend, chosen to spare them. She had won the battle, she realized with a sinking heart, but the war for their freedom had just begun. The chambers they were given were larger than her entire cottage, a suite of rooms carved into the mountain's peak. One wall was a vast, unadorned window of polished crystal, looking out over the valley below. From this height, her village was a toy town, a smudge of smoke and distant lights nestled in the darkness. The sight of it, so close and yet so impossibly far, sent a pang of homesickness through her, so sharp it was like a physical blow. The rooms were furnished with a stark, masculine elegance, heavy, dark wood furniture, deep crimson tapestries depicting ancient, forgotten battles, and a hearth where a fire already burned, its flames a welcome, living thing in the oppressive stillness of the castle. A young vampire, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17 at the time of his turning, brought them food. His name was Kylen, and his eyes held a nervous curiosity rather than the cold contempt of the others in the court. He set a silver tray on the table, roasted fowl, fresh bread, cheese, and a pitcher of milk for Leo. The king commanded it. My lady, he mumbled, not quite meeting her eyes. He said the boy must eat. Ilara thanked him, her voice tight. She sat Leo at the table and coaxed him to eat, breaking the bread into small pieces for him. He was quiet, his eyes wide as he took in the strange, grand room. He was not frightened, not yet. To him, this was a great, dark adventure, a fairy tale castle. He did not understand the nature of the cage. Ilara understood it all too well. The food was a leash. The warmth was a chain. The comfort was a means of control. For 3 days, they lived in this gilded cage. Ilara did not leave the rooms, though the door was unlocked. She sat by the crystal window for hours, watching the slow crawl of sun and shadow across her world below, feeling like a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. She told Leo stories, played quiet games with him on the thick carpets, and held him whenever a flicker of fear crossed his face. She was a fortress of calm for her son, but inside, she was a storm of anxiety. The king did not come. He sent Kylen with their meals, sent fresh linens, sent a small wooden horse for Leo, a beautifully carved toy that her son immediately loved. Each gift felt like a tightening of the net. He was showing her what he could provide, the luxury he could offer, a stark contrast to their simple life. He was trying to buy her compliance. On the 4th night, sleep would not come. Leo was breathing softly in the large, canopied bed, a small lump under the velvet coverlet. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, painting the room in shades of orange and deep shadow. Restless, Ilara paced the length of the chamber, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. She stopped at the window, pressing her forehead against the cool, smooth surface. The moon was a sliver of bone in the inky sky, and the stars were a remote, glittering host. They were the same stars she had looked at from her cottage window, but here, they seemed colder, more distant. A soft sound from the doorway made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. Kosimir stood there, a silhouette against the torchlight of the corridor. He had not made a sound approaching. He moved with the silence of a predator, a silence that was more terrifying than any roar. He was dressed simply, in black trousers and a loose white shirt, unadorned by the regalia he had worn in the throne room. Without the weight of his crown and robes, he looked younger, yet the ancient weariness was still there in the set of his shoulders, in the depths of his ember eyes. "I did not mean to frighten you," he said, his voice a low murmur that did not disturb the sleeping child. Ilara's hand went to her throat. She said nothing, simply watched him, her body coiled and ready to spring to Leo's side. He took a slow step into the room, then another, his gaze taking in the space, the dying fire, the toy horse lying on the rug. "Are the accommodations to your satisfaction?" The question was so mundane, so absurdly normal, that it threw her off balance. "This is a prison, not a guest house," she said, her voice sharp with a week's worth of pent-up fear and frustration. "No amount of soft blankets can change that." A flicker of something, surprise, amusement, crossed his face. "A prison is a place you cannot leave. The door is not locked, Ilara. And where would I go? With your court of shadows waiting outside. Back down the mountain, only to be hunted and brought back before we reach the tree line?" She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her. "Your freedom is an illusion." "Perhaps," he admitted, his gaze intense. He walked over to the hearth, poking at the embers with an iron poker until they sparked back to life. "But the alternative was to take your son and send you home to an empty house. Would you have preferred that honesty?" His words struck a nerve, raw and painful. He was right, of course. She would endure anything to keep Leo with her. He knew it. He was counting on it. "Why?" she asked, the question raw and desperate. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" He turned from the fire, his face half in shadow, half in the renewed glow of the flames. The light caught the silver of his hair, the sharp line of his jaw. "I have lived for more than 2,000 years, he said, his voice quiet, confessional. "I have seen civilizations turn to dust. I have watched the stars shift in the sky. I have grown tired. The world has lost its flavor. Everything is a repetition, an echo of something I have seen 100 times before." He looked at her, and his eyes were not the eyes of a monster, but of the loneliest creature in existence. "And then you walked into my hall. You, a mortal woman with nothing but the fire in your heart for a weapon, and you looked at me, and you were not afraid." "I was terrified," she breathed, the admission a crack in her armor. "No," he corrected her gently. "You were afraid. But you were not broken by it. Your love for him was greater than your fear of me. I have not seen its equal in all my long years." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You are the first thing that has felt new in a millennium. That is what I want. I want to understand it." Ilara stared at him, speechless. This was not the answer she had expected. Not a desire for a new plaything, or a political maneuver, or a cruel, drawn-out torment. It was a plea. A confession of a loneliness so vast and profound she could barely comprehend it. She saw him then, not as a king or a predator, but as a man trapped in an eternity he had not chosen, starved for a glimpse of the very thing that made her own life so precious and so fragile, love. The moment was broken by a small, sleepy sound from the bed. "Mama!" Leo's voice was thick with sleep. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, his golden hair a messy halo around his head. He blinked at the tall, silver-haired man standing by the fire. He wasn't afraid. He was just a child, waking in a strange place. "Are you a knight?" he asked the king, his voice full of sleepy curiosity. Cosimir froze. He seemed utterly unprepared for the child's question. He looked from the boy to Ilara, a flicker of something almost like panic in his ancient eyes. He, who had commanded armies and felled kings, was rendered speechless by a sleepy 4-year-old. Ilara felt a hysterical laugh bubble in her chest. She choked it back, moving to the bedside and smoothing Leo's hair. "No, my love. This is our host. The king." Leo's eyes widened. "The king?" He looked at Cosimir, who still hadn't moved. "Do you have a horse?" The question was so innocent, so utterly out of place in the charged atmosphere, that it shattered the tension completely. Casimir stared at the boy, and for the first time, Ilara saw the mask of the ancient monarch crack. A genuine, uncalculated expression crossed his face. It was utter bewilderment. "I have many horses," Casimir said, his voice sounding strangely formal. "Can I ride one?" Leo asked, now fully awake and excited by the prospect. Ilara put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Leo, it is the middle of the night. The king is busy." "No," Casimir said quickly, his gaze fixed on the boy. "I am not." He looked at Ilara, a question in his eyes. It was the first time he had asked for her permission for anything. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. He was giving her back a piece of her own power. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps tomorrow. When the sun is up." A look of profound relief crossed Casimir's face. He nodded, a sharp, almost grateful gesture. "Tomorrow," he agreed. He backed away toward the door, his regal composure slightly ruffled. "Sleep well," he murmured, and then he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the corridor as silently as he had arrived. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed, her heart still beating a little too fast. She tucked Leo back under the covers, his mind already full of dreams of horses. The encounter had changed something. The lines she had drawn, the simple narrative of monster and victim, had begun to blur. She had come face to face with the king, and had found not a monster, but a man drowning in the lonely sea of his own immortality. And her son, in his innocence, had just thrown him a lifeline. She didn't know if that made him more or less dangerous. The next day, the castle was different. The oppressive hostility of the court seemed to have lessened, replaced by a current of baffled curiosity. Whispers followed Ilara and Leo as Kylen escorted them to the castle's vast, echoing library. Casimir had suggested it, a place for Leo to look at picture books of animals and for Ilara to have a change of scenery. He was not there himself, but his presence was felt in the way the other vampires gave them a wide berth, their dark eyes watching but keeping their distance. The library was a wonder, a circular chamber rising 3 stories, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books. A rolling ladder stretched up into the shadows, and a large, intricately detailed globe stood in the center of the room. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. For the first time since arriving, Ilara felt a flicker of something other than fear. She was a scholar's daughter, she had grown up with the scent of paper and ink. This was a sanctuary. She found a large, leather-bound bestiary for Leo, its pages filled with lavish illustrations of creatures both real and imagined. He sat on a cushion by the fire, utterly engrossed, tracing the lines of a griffin with his small finger. Ilara, for her part, wandered the shelves, her fingers ghosting over the spines of books written in languages she couldn't recognize. These were not just books, they were history, the collected knowledge of millennia. She felt the immense weight of time in this room, the sheer scale of the life the king had lived. She pulled a volume at random, a history of the valley written in her own tongue. The script was archaic, the pages brittle with age. She sat in a high-backed chair near the fire and began to read. It told the story of the long winter, 300 years ago, when a blight had destroyed the crops and a plague had followed, decimating the villages. It was a time of desperation and fear. And then it spoke of the king under the mountain. It described how he had descended with his court, not as a conqueror, but as a savior. He had brought them food from his own stores, his healers had taught them how to brew tonics from mountain herbs that fought the plague. He had saved them. The tithe, the book explained, was not a punishment. It was a compact. In exchange for his protection, for ensuring the valley would never again face such a calamity, they had offered a tribute. A child, to be raised in the king's court, to learn its ways, to act as a bridge between their two peoples. The first few tithes had been volunteers, children of nobles honored to be chosen. It was only over generations, as memory faded and fear took root, that the story had twisted, the tribute becoming a sacrifice, the king a monster who fed on their children. Ilara stared at the page, the words blurring. Everything she had believed, the foundational terror of her world, was a lie. A misunderstanding that had curdled into a monstrous tradition. He wasn't a baby-eater. He was a lonely, forgotten guardian. History is written by the fearful as often as it is by the victors. Casimir's voice, quiet and close, made her jump. He was standing behind her chair, looking down at the book in her lap. She hadn't heard him approach. "You saved us," she whispered, her mind reeling. "We saved each other," he corrected softly. "My people were starving as well. The blight affected the animals we feed on. Your ancestors offered a trade. Blood, willingly given, in exchange for grain and medicine. The child was meant to be an ambassador, a symbol of our treaty. A way to ensure the promise was never forgotten." He sighed, a sound like stones grinding together. "But mortals forget. Your lives are so brief." The story changed in the telling. The king became a convenient monster to blame for the shadows on the mountain and the chill in the winter wind. He moved to stand by the fire, his profile etched in gold by the flames. "I did not correct the narrative. Fear is a more effective deterrent than gratitude. It kept the peace. It's a cruel peace," she said, her voice stronger now. "Built on the terror of mothers." He turned to her, and the weariness in his eyes was a chasm. "It is the only kind I know how to keep." He looked over at Leo, who had fallen asleep by the fire, his cheek pillowed on the open page of the bestiary. A look of profound, aching gentleness softened the king's harsh features. "He is the first child to come to this castle in a century who was not brought in tears. The first whose mother came with him." He knelt by the sleeping boy, his movement surprisingly fluid. He reached out a hand, his long, pale fingers hovering over Leo's golden hair, a breath away from touching him. The gesture was so full of a hesitant, desperate longing that it made Alara's heart ache. He wanted to connect, but had forgotten how. He had all the power in the world, but could not permit himself this one small, gentle touch. "Why did you never have children of your own?" The question was out before she could stop it. It was too personal, too forward, but the moment seemed to demand it. Cosimir drew his hand back, clenching it into a fist at his side. He rose and turned away, staring into the fire. "We cannot," he said, his voice flat. "Immortality comes at a price. We are frozen in time, perfect and unchanging. We are statues. We can appreciate beauty, but we cannot create it. We are an end, not a beginning." The finality in his words was devastating. Ilara finally understood the true nature of his curse. It was not bloodlust or a weakness to the sun. It was sterility. An eternal, unchanging existence with no hope of a future, no legacy to leave behind but stories that would inevitably be twisted into nightmares. He was the king of a dying race, presiding over a slow, elegant, inevitable extinction. And then she understood why he had been so captivated by her defiance. It wasn't just her courage. It was her motherhood. She was life. She was creation. She was everything he could never be. She had walked into his hall of endings, carrying a beginning in her arms. That afternoon, he kept his promise. He led them to the castle stables, a vast, vaulted space where magnificent black horses stamped in stalls filled with clean straw. Leo's eyes were like saucers. Cosimir himself, surprisingly gentle, lifted Leo onto the back of a calm, old mare. He led the horse by the reins, walking it slowly around the cobblestone courtyard as Ilara watched from the sidelines, her arms crossed against a sudden chill. The sight was surreal. The ancient vampire king, ruler of the night court, patiently leading a horse for a chattering, laughing human child. The other vampires watched from shadowed archways, their faces a mixture of disbelief and disapproval. Ilara could feel their resentment, a cold, palpable wave. She was an intrusion, a disruption to their timeless, ordered world. Her son was a sacrilege. And the king's fascination with them was a weakness they would not tolerate forever. A tall, imperious vampire with cold, blue eyes and a cruel slash of a mouth detached himself from the shadows. Ilara recognized him as one of the king's inner circle, a man who had watched her in the throne room with undisguised contempt. "The boy is loud," the vampire said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He was speaking to Ilara, but his eyes were fixed on Cosimir and Leo. "He disturbs the peace." "His name is Valerus," Cosimir said, not turning around, his voice calm but with a new, hard edge. "Pay him no mind. His heart froze long before the rest of him did. Valerus's lips thinned. He took a step closer to Alara. The king amuses himself with you, mortal. But his infatuation will pass. And when it does, you will find the hospitality of this court is not so generous. His eyes flicked toward Leo, and the threat was unmistakable. Before Alara could react, Cosimir was there. He had crossed the courtyard in a silent, impossible blur of speed. He stood between Alara and Valerus, his back to her, but she could feel the rage rolling off him in icy waves. He was taller than Valerus, and in that moment, he seemed to swell, to become something more than a man, a creature of pure, ancient power. You will address my guest with respect, Valerus. Casimir's voice was dangerously soft. Or you will not address her at all. She is a human, Valerus spat. A plaything. She makes you weak. She makes me curious, Cosimir corrected, his voice dropping even lower. And you are beginning to bore me. Leave. Now. Valerus held the king's gaze for a long, tense moment. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Then, with a faint sneer, he gave a mocking bow and retreated back into the shadows of the castle. The confrontation was over as quickly as it had begun. Cosimir turned back to Alara, the fury draining from his face, replaced by a weary concern. He will not trouble you again. But Alara knew it was a lie. She had seen the hatred in Valerus's eyes. She was a threat to their way of life, and Casimir's protection only made her a more tempting target. She was no longer just a prisoner, she was the focal point of a power struggle she didn't understand. Her presence was a stone dropped into a still, dark pool, and the ripples were spreading. Later that week, a fever took hold of Leo. It came on suddenly, as childhood illnesses often do. One moment he was happily building a tower of books in the library, the next he was listless, his forehead burning hot against her lips. Ilara's blood ran cold. She put him to bed, sponging his face with cool water, but the fever only climbed. He began to cry, a weak, fretful sound that tore at her heart. She was alone. Utterly alone. There were no village healers here, no wise women with their poultices and teas. She was trapped in a castle of monsters, and her child was sick. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. She didn't know how he knew. Perhaps he heard the crying, perhaps he simply sensed her distress. But her chamber door opened, and Cosimir was there. He took in the scene in an instant, Leo flushed and shivering in the bed, Ilara's pale, frantic face. What is it? He asked, his voice tight with an unfamiliar emotion. A fever, she said, her voice trembling. His burning up. I don't know what to do. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling by the bed. He reached out and gently laid the back of his hand against Leo's forehead. His touch was impossibly cold, like marble, a stark contrast to the boy's fiery skin. Leo whimpered and tried to pull away. His heat is alarming, Cosimir stated, his brow furrowed. He looked at Alara, and she saw a reflection of her own fear in his ancient eyes. He was the all-powerful king, but he was as helpless in the face of this simple, mortal ailment as she was. There are herbs, he said, thinking aloud. In the high gardens. The ones my healers used during the plague. Willow bark, fever few. He stood abruptly. Kylen, he roared, his voice echoing with command. The young vampire appeared in the doorway almost instantly, his eyes wide. Summon the healers. Send someone to the high gardens for feverfew and willowbark. At once. And bring cold, fresh water from the mountain spring. The commands were sharp, precise. The king was in motion, a force of nature unleashed. For the next several hours, he did not leave their side. He directed the vampire healers, 2 ancient, silent women, as they brewed a bitter tea. He held the cup for Alara as she patiently coaxed the liquid into Leo, drop by drop. He took the cloths from her, dipping them in the ice-cold spring water and laying them on Leo's forehead himself, his movements surprisingly gentle, almost tender. They worked together in silence, a strange, desperate alliance. The king of the night and the human mother, united in their fight for the life of one small boy. Alara watched him, saw the genuine, raw fear in his face, and knew that this was not a performance. His concern was real. He was terrified of losing this small spark of light that had so unexpectedly entered his twilight world. Toward dawn, the fever broke. The heat receded, leaving Leo pale and sweat-drenched, but finally sleeping a deep, natural sleep. Ilara sagged with relief, the tension draining out of her so suddenly she felt dizzy. She looked up at Kosimir, who was standing by the window, watching the first pale hint of sunrise touch the distant peaks. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt inadequate. He turned, his face haggard in the grey light. There were shadows under his eyes she had never seen before. "I have faced armies without a flicker of fear," he said, his voice raw. "I have never felt terror like I did tonight." He walked over to the bed, looking down at the sleeping child. "Your mortal lives are so fragile. Like a candle flame in a high wind. It is a terrifying thing to behold." He looked at her, his ember eyes full of a new, profound respect. "And you live with this fear every day. Yet you love so fiercely. How?" "Because it's worth it," she answered simply. "The fragility is what makes it precious. We don't have forever. We only have now." He considered her words, a deep, thoughtful expression on his face. He reached out, as if to touch her cheek, but stopped himself, his hand hovering in the space between them. The air crackled with unspoken emotion. It was a moment of profound, shared vulnerability. They were no longer king and captive, monster and victim. They were just two people who had stood a vigil together, bound by their shared love for a child. "You should rest, Ilara," he said softly, his voice full of a tenderness that made her heart ache. He drew his hand back. "I will have Kylen stand guard outside your door. No one will disturb you." He left, and Ilara crawled into bed beside Leo, curling her body around his. For the first time since she had arrived, she did not feel like a prisoner. She felt safe, protected. And as she drifted off to sleep, she was forced to admit a terrifying, world-altering truth. She was safer here, in the heart of the mountain with the vampire king, than she had ever felt in her life. In the weeks that followed Leo's recovery, the fabric of their existence within the castle shifted. The quiet tension between Ilara and Kosimir had been replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. He no longer seemed like a jailer, and she no longer felt entirely like a prisoner. They fell into a strange, domestic rhythm. Mornings were spent in the library, afternoons in the courtyard or the vast, echoing armory, where Leo would marvel at the rows of silent, gleaming armor. Kosimir was a constant, quiet presence. He would appear without a sound, often just to watch them, a solitary figure in the shadows. But increasingly, he would join them. He taught Leo the names of the constellations from an ancient star chart in the library. He showed Ilara the castle's hidden gardens, pockets of impossible green life tucked into rock grottos, fed by underground springs and lit by glowing crystals. He spoke of his past, not as a king, but as a man who had been a Roman soldier, a scholar in Alexandria, a wanderer who had watched the world change around his unchanging form. Ilara, in turn, told him of her life. Of the smell of the sea, of the taste of wild strawberries in summer, of the simple, profound joy of watching her son learn to walk. She described the vibrant, fleeting beauty of a mortal life, and he listened with a rapt attention that was both flattering and heartbreaking. He was drinking in her stories, her experiences, like a man dying of thirst. One evening, they stood on a high balcony overlooking the valley. The sun had set, and the world below was a tapestry of twinkling lights and deep blue shadows. Leo was asleep inside, tired out from a day of exploration. "Do you miss it?" Kosimir asked, his voice a low murmur beside her. "Your world?" "Sometimes," she admitted, her gaze on the distant cluster of lights that was her village. "I miss the feel of dirt under my fingernails from my garden. I miss the gossiping women at the well. I miss the sun." He was silent for a long moment. "It is one of the things I have forgotten most clearly," he said, his voice tinged with a deep, ancient sadness. "The warmth of it on my skin. I remember that it was pleasant. But the sensation itself is gone. A word without a meaning." She looked at him. In the pale moonlight, he was heartbreakingly beautiful, a statue carved from sorrow and silver. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to reach out, to touch his hand, to offer some small, human comfort. She resisted, curling her fingers into her palm. "What is it you fear, Kosimir?" she asked softly, using his name for the first time. He turned to her, his ember eyes searching her face. He had expected the question to be about death, or pain, or his enemies. But she was asking something deeper. "I do not fear an end," he said slowly. "Sometimes, I think I would welcome it. I fear this." He gestured out at the unchanging, eternal night. The sameness. The endless repetition. The slow erosion of memory until all that is left is a grey fog of existence. "I fear becoming nothing more than a collection of forgotten moments." He looked at her, and the raw vulnerability in his gaze stole her breath. "Before you came, I was already a ghost. You and the boy, you are the only real things to happen to me in 500 years. My greatest fear," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper, "is that you will leave, and I will be a ghost once more." The confession hung in the air between them, intimate and terrifying. He was giving her a weapon, the knowledge of her power over him. But it did not feel like a weapon. It felt like a gift. An offering of trust so profound it made her tremble. The court, however, was not blind to the change in their king. His fascination with the human woman had moved beyond a mere curiosity. It was an obsession. He neglected his duties, spending his nights with her and the boy, leaving the governance of their dark kingdom to his council. Valerus, in particular, watched with a simmering rage. He saw the king's humanity reawakening not as a miracle, but as a disease, a weakness that would destroy them all. The breaking point came during a formal court gathering. It was a rare occasion, where the entire vampire aristocracy assembled in the throne room. Kosimir sat on his obsidian throne, but his attention was not on the proceedings. It was on Alara and Leo, who stood near a pillar at the side of the hall. He had insisted they attend, a public declaration of their protected status. To the court, it was a slap in the face. Valerus chose his moment perfectly. During a lull in the proceedings, he stepped forward, his voice ringing with theatrical outrage. "My king, how long will you allow this farce to continue?" he demanded, gesturing a contemptuous hand toward Alara. "You shame us. You shame your crown by elevating these mortals. They are cattle. They are food. They are not our equals." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled vampires. Casimir's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "You overstep, Valerus." "Do I?" Valerus challenged, emboldened by the support of the court. "Or do I speak the truth you have forgotten? They have made you weak. That child," he pointed a sharp finger at Leo, who shrank behind Alara's legs, "is a liability. A weakness any of our enemies could exploit. He is a dagger pointed at your heart to prove his point." Valerus moved with preternatural speed, a blur of motion aimed directly at Leo. He never reached him. Kosimir was faster. The king moved not like a man, but like a bolt of lightning, a force of pure, destructive rage. He intercepted Valerus, his hand closing around the other vampire's throat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. The entire court gasped. "You," Kosimir snarled, his voice a low, terrifying growl, his eyes blazing with molten fury, "will never touch him. You will never speak his name again." The king's power flared, a palpable wave of cold dread that forced everyone in the room, Alara included, to their knees. It was the first time she had seen the full, untamed extent of his ancient might. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. And it was all in defense of her son. With a final look of utter contempt, Kosimir hurled Valerus across the hall. The vampire crashed into a stone column with enough force to crack the ancient rock, slumping to the ground, broken and defeated. Kosimir stood over him, his chest heaving, the wave of power slowly receding. He turned his burning gaze on the rest of the silent, terrified court. "This woman and this child are under my personal protection. They are more precious to me than this crown, than this castle, than any of you." His voice rang with absolute authority. "The old ways are ending. The tithe, the compact that has bound us to a lie for 300 years, is over. From this night forward, we will not take from the humans. We will live apart. This is my decree." He turned, his fury melting away as his eyes found Alara. He walked to her, ignoring the chaos and the shock of his court. He knelt before her and Leo, a king humbling himself before a mortal. "I have endangered you both," he said, his voice ragged with self-recrimination. "My world is too dangerous. My people will not accept you. I was selfish to keep you here." He looked her in the eye, and what she saw there broke her heart. It was resignation. It was sacrifice. "I am giving you a choice," he said, his voice clear and steady, though it cost him everything. "A real one. You and Leo are free to go. Kylen will escort you back to your village at dawn. No one will stop you. You have my word. You can go home." The offer was a punch to the gut. The freedom she had dreamed of, the escape she had prayed for, was finally hers. She could take Leo home, back to their cottage, back to the sun and the dirt and the gossip at the well. They would be safe. But as she looked into Casimir's anguished eyes, she knew it was the last thing in the world she wanted. Home was no longer a place. It was a feeling. It was the safety she felt when he was near. It was the understanding that passed between them in a shared glance. It was the sight of him teaching her son about the stars. To leave now would be to tear her own heart out. She started, but the words wouldn't come. "Go," he whispered, his face a mask of pain. "Live your life, Ilara. Be happy. That is all I ask." He stood and walked away, not looking back, leaving her standing in the stunned silence of the throne room with a choice that felt more like a death sentence. The journey down the mountain was the opposite of the journey up. The path was familiar, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight of the castle receded with every step. Kylen walked with them, a silent, sad guardian, his youthful face etched with a misery that mirrored her own. Leo, holding her hand, was quiet. He didn't understand the finality of their departure, but he sensed the sorrow that clung to his mother like a shroud. They reached the edge of the woods as the sun was beginning to warm the sky. The village lay before them, just as she had left it. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer echoed in the morning air. It was home. "This is as far as I can go, my lady," Kylen said, his voice soft. He looked at her, his young old eyes full of sympathy. "He will miss you." Ilara could only nod, a lump forming in her throat. She watched him melt back into the shadows of the forest, and then she was alone. She took Leo's hand and walked into the village. People stared. They pointed. Whispers followed them like ghosts. She was the woman whose son was taken by the tithe, returned from the dead. She saw old friends, women she had known her whole life, and they looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear. She was tainted by the mountain, marked by the Shadow King. She was no longer one of them. Their cottage was just as they had left it, a layer of dust covering every surface. Ilara opened the shutters, letting the sunlight stream in. The light felt alien, too bright, too harsh. The silence of the small house was deafening. It was not the companionable silence she had shared with Cosimir in the vast library. It was an empty, hollow silence, filled with the absence of him. She went through the motions of their old life. She fetched water from the well, she tended to her neglected garden, she baked honey cakes for Leo. But the flavor was gone from her life, just as he had said it was from his. The world felt muted, washed out, a pale imitation of the vibrant, dangerous, emotionally charged world she had inhabited in the castle. Leo felt it too. He was subdued, listless. He didn't want to play with the other village children, who treated him with a cautious curiosity that bordered on cruelty. He missed the big, dark castle. He missed the horses. He missed the quiet, silver-haired king who had shown him the stars. "When are we going back to see Cosimir?" he asked one evening, his small voice full of a longing that mirrored the ache in her own chest. "We're not, my love," she said, her voice thick. "This is our home now." "I don't like this home," he said, his lower lip trembling. "I want the other one." That night, Ilara lay awake in her small bed, the moonlight striping the floor. She had what she had fought for. Her son was safe. They were free. But she had never felt more imprisoned. She was trapped in a life that no longer fit her, a world that had shrunk around her. She had stood up to a king to protect her child, and in doing so, had found a connection so profound that life without it was a kind of living death. She had told him that the fragility of mortal life was what made it precious. that they only had now. And she was wasting her now, living in the ghost of a past life, too afraid to seize the future that had been offered to her. He had given her a choice, and she had made the wrong one. She had chosen safety over love, and the silence of her cottage was her punishment. She thought of him, alone in his vast, cold castle, having pushed away the only real thing in his life out of a misguided sense of honor. He was a ghost once more, just as he had feared. And she was a ghost, haunting her own house. The decision, when it came, was not a lightning bolt. It was a slow, steady dawn. She could not live like this. She would not. Her son deserved more than a half-life with a hollowed-out mother. And Cosimir deserved to know that he was not a monster, that the connection between them was real, and that she was not afraid. The next morning, she packed a small bag with bread, cheese, and a change of clothes. She took Leo by the hand, her heart no longer heavy with sorrow, but light with a terrifying, thrilling resolve. "Where are we going, Mama?" he asked, his eyes bright with hope. She smiled, a real smile, for the first time in weeks. "We're going home," she said. The journey back up the mountain felt different. She was not a victim being marched to her doom, nor a refugee fleeing a broken heart. She was a woman walking toward her destiny, her steps sure and certain. The path was steep, but her purpose gave her strength. When she reached the great obsidian gates, they remained closed. She did not hesitate. She raised a hand and knocked, the sound echoing in the mountain silence. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, with a deep groan of ancient metal, the gates swung inward. Kylen stood there, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "My lady. Ilara." "I've come home, Kylen," she said simply. "Is he here?" The young vampire nodded, speechless, and stepped aside to let her pass. The great hall was empty, silent, and colder than she remembered. The torches seemed to burn lower, the shadows seemed deeper. The life she and Leo had brought to this place was gone, and its absence was a palpable thing. She left Leo with a still stunned Kylen and walked toward the throne room. The doors were open. He was there, sitting on his obsidian throne, but he was not the king she had first met. He was slumped, a figure of profound defeat, staring at nothing, the ember glow in his eyes reduced to a dull, dying coal. He looked smaller, diminished by his grief. He did not seem to notice her at first. She walked down the long hall, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. When she was halfway to the dais, his head lifted slowly. He saw her. He froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. He thought she was a hallucination, a phantom born of his own desperate loneliness. He rose slowly from the throne, a hesitant, uncertain movement. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice a raw, broken thing. She stopped at the foot of the dais, just as she had done the first time. But this time, there was no fear in her heart. Only love. "You told me my life was precious because it was fleeting," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet strength that filled the empty hall. "You told me all we have is now. I will not waste my now in a world that you are not in." He descended the steps, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he were afraid she might vanish if he blinked. He stopped before her, so close she could see the flicker of hope warring with centuries of despair in his eyes. "You came back," he whispered, as if it were a miracle he could not comprehend. "I came home," she corrected gently. She raised a hand and, this time, she did not hesitate. She laid her palm against his cheek. His skin was cool, like stone, but she could feel a tremor run through him at her touch. It was the first time she had ever touched him. It felt like coming home. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a starving man offered bread. A shuddering breath escaped him. "I am a monster, Ilara. My world will destroy you." "No," she said, her voice firm. "You are a man who has been alone for too long. And we will not be destroyed. We will build a new world. Together." He opened his eyes, and the embers were blazing back to life, bright with a hope so fierce it was painful to see. He raised his own hand, his cold fingers gently covering hers, holding her hand to his face. He looked at her, truly saw her, her strength, her love, her unwavering resolve, and in that moment, the last of the ice around his ancient heart shattered forever. He did not say "I love you." The words were too small for the vastness of what he felt. Instead, he simply looked at her, and his eyes said it all. Leo came running in then, Kylen trailing helplessly behind him. He ran straight to Cosimir and wrapped his small arms around the king's legs in an exuberant hug. "We're home," he cried happily. Cosimir looked down at the boy, then back at Ilara, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile of such profound, unadulterated joy that it transformed him, erasing the weariness of ages and leaving only the man behind. He knelt, gathering the small boy into his arms, and then looked up at Ilara, his heart in his eyes. He held out his other hand to her. She took it. Their fingers intertwined, her warmth against his cool skin, a perfect, impossible balance. And in the quiet grandeur of the ancient throne room, a new family was forged, not of blood, but of choice. A mortal woman, an immortal king, and a little boy with hair like the sun, standing together at the dawn of a new age, their linked hands a promise that even the longest night must eventually give way to morning. The peace he had kept through fear would now be a peace kept through love, a far stronger and more resilient thing, destined to last longer than any treaty written in blood or stone.